This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. And regular listeners will know that I've recently interviewed the two winners of the inaugural AASA prizes. And these were established by Siobhan O'Sullivan, the founding host of this very podcast. More prize competitions will be open in the future, but they're only open to AASA members. So if you're not already a member, you should join now. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a series of academic books about animal studies covering a range of disciplinary perspectives and asking a lot of the central questions of the discipline. 4 books were published in the series last year, and I've been told that there are lots of new titles coming this year too. Today's episode of Knowing Animals is a special one for me, because not only is today's guest a returning guest, but it was me at the helm the first time she appeared on the podcast. Dr Emelia Quinn is Assistant Professor of World Literatures and Environmental Humanities at the University of Amsterdam. When she first appeared on Knowing Animals, she was talking about the vegan camp aesthetic, and she mentioned that she had a forthcoming book. I'm very pleased that we're going to be talking about that book today. Reading Veganism, the Monstrous Vegan 1818 to present, has just been published by Oxford University Press. Welcome to the podcast, Emelia.
Hi, thank you, Josh.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to work on the topic of the monstrous vegan?
Yeah, sure. So the book comes out of my PhD. And when I went into the PhD, I was interested in the kind of lacuna there seemed to be in the humanities of talking about veganism. And so I wanted to think about what it meant to read in a vegan way or read from a vegan perspective as literary scholars. The PhD started as I wanted to do a literary history of cheese, and that soon kind of derailed when the books that I was reading, I kept finding this monster appearing, a monster who was refusing to eat animals, and that there seemed to be a connection across all the texts. And so I started to look more closely at why that was. Why was this monster reappearing in various different guises across literary history? And why did they seem to be provoking such a seemingly inexplicable anxiety in those who encountered them? So it really turned into a project of what it means to kind of live, enact, or perform vegan identity. And so what I have is there's kind of 2 clear parts of the book. Part 1, which is really trying to trace a literary history of this monstrous vegan figure. So to define it, identify it, establish it as a distinct literary trope. And so I trace it from Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein through to the kind of late 19th century science fiction stories of H.G. Wells, and then through to the contemporary fiction of Margaret Atwood. And then in part 2, because the book is not just, I guess, a historical study, but it's also very much an attempt to establish what vegan theory is or what a vegan theoretical approach to literature might be. So in part 2, I start to think about what we actually might do with that monster and whether we can kind of embrace it and reclaim it in some way, and if that might provide a way of kind of rethinking how we interact in the world as vegans.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I really want to get back to those questions of identity and enactment of vegan identities in a little while. But I thought it'd be first interesting to start talking about what this monstrous vegan trope is. So in the introduction and throughout the work, you identify 4 features of the monstrous vegan. And I'm going to quote you here just from page 3 of the introduction. You say, first, monstrous vegans do not eat animals, an abstinence that generates a seemingly inexplicable anxiety in those who encounter them. Second, they are hybrid assemblages of human and non-human animal parts, destabilizing species boundaries. Third, monstrous vegans are sired outside of heterosexual reproduction, the product of male acts of creation. And finally, monstrous vegans are intimately connected to acts of writing and literary creation. Now, there's a lot to talk about there, but let me ask you about the first of those criteria, first of all. and that is the fact that monstrous vegans don't eat meat. But what's striking is, of course, that veganism is about more than just abstinence from meat. So why do you frame these as vegan monsters rather than, say, vegetarian monsters?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. It's a great question. And obviously, by starting with Frankenstein, 1818 is a time in which we don't have the term vegan as a kind of lexically comprehensive term. The monster does eat cheese and milk, and so isn't vegan in a classic definition of the sense. But what I seek to do in the book is to say these are vegan monsters because they embody a kind of difficulty. And so in the introduction, I established that there is a distinction to be made in theoretical terms between vegetarianism, which gives you a very clear sense of identity, right? That if you don't eat meat, you are a vegetarian. It's quite clear. It's a stable sense of self achieved. Whereas veganism, even in the kind of official vegan society definition, is established as something that can only go so far, that it's kind of tethered by what is possible in the current system. And so I think about the fact that we really can't be 100% vegan. We can only strive to be as vegan as possible, right? So I see it as this utopian striving. And so these monsters to me are vegan monsters and not, say, vegetarian monsters, because they embody this tension between utopian desires for a kind of world without animal suffering, but also the tensions of insufficiency and failure. And so that is what makes it the vegan monster, as opposed to a rigid definition of they do not eat any animal products and they do not wear leather, if that makes sense.
I see. So is this insufficiency, this inevitable failure, is that inherent to veganism, or is that just inherent to veganism in the current moment, or is that just something that most vegans grapple with, or where exactly does that stand in relation to the vegan identity?
So, in my sense of it, it is inherent to veganism. I think it would be naive to suggest that there is this kind of end state. And ultimately, the reason for thinking about the monstrous is that I think there's something productive to be done in recognizing that this is an endless journey, right, and an endless response. And it also helps to kind of counter a lot of the mainstream, I think, misconceptions of veganism, that it is this movement of purity and rigid policing, and that it isn't engaged in these more difficult questions of what we do with something that we can't quite control.
Yes, I see what you mean. So let me ask about another one of these traits of the monstrous vegan, and that's the fourth one. You say that the monstrous vegan is intimately connected to acts of writing and literary creation. What do you mean by that?
So what I found interesting as I was, as I say, tracing these figures and working out what was connecting them, because they all, certainly from Shelley through Wells through Atwood, each one is explicitly rewriting the other. And so what I started to notice that all of them were kind of very metatextual in that they are engaged with the idea that these are creations that have been written, and that there's something perhaps monstrous about the literary. And so I try and delve deeper into what that is doing in each of these texts. And for all of them, it seems that it's this anxiety about what it means to have a distinction between a kind of biological body that has urges and desires versus this kind of ethical code that is kind of already these kind of pre-decided restrictions. And so in H.G. Well, it's this kind of veganism is this recitation of constant like kind of vows that you will not eat meat. And Atwood also explores the kind of difficulty of it being this written code that gets inscribed onto bodies. And so that's what I mean by that. And I'm interested, I guess, in how the monstrous vegan grapples with the tension that I do think we have to face as vegans, of the way in which, an idealized code of ethics comes into contrast with actually things we find pleasurable or things we enjoy, and that the body and the mind don't always match up particularly neatly.
Mm. And it's very interesting what you say about the way that these authors are retelling the same story. I mean, there's a deliberate and explicit even callback to Frankenstein in the work of these later authors. And so I just wonder, and of course your definition as well, when you talk about the monstrous vegan being a mix of human and animal parts, I mean, that's so clear in Frankenstein. So I just wonder, to what extent is this monstrous vegan trope tied up intimately with Frankenstein? Is there a monstrous vegan tradition outside of this Frankenstein and then the retelling of Frankenstein's? Or do you think that Frankenstein is kind of central to it?
That's a really great question, actually, Josh. I think certainly in my book, Frankenstein is really central and performed this role of this trope, as you say, that is constantly being referred back to as this foundational figure. What I gesture to in the conclusion of my book is kind of what is there a monstrous vegan that exists outside this very Anglophone kind of Western tradition? And the answer is really, I don't know, but I would like to invite people to discover that, because right now, yeah, it's very much part of this kind of British and North American tradition of a very clear science fiction canon. And I guess partly I was interested in thinking about how these texts that are so in the mainstream that we know so well, how these elements have been ignored or obscured, and so what we gain by recovering that from canonical texts. But there's not to say that there's not a kind of whole world out there, both within the broader scheme of world literature, but in the kind of scheme of texts that don't fit into the literary canon as we know it.
Yes, I see. And I was wondering, there are other authors who talked about what we might call monstrous vegans. So James Stanescu, Laura Wright, and of course you engage with Laura Wright a lot in the book, David Del Principe, or Principe, I'm not sure how that's pronounced. These are all authors who are looking at TV, film, literature, and finding these monsters, sometimes vampires, sometimes other kinds of things, that don't eat meat or at least inhabit something like a vegetarian or vegan identity. So I wondered to what extent the work of these authors tie into the same tradition that you're offering, or whether you think it's a different tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I think James Stanescu's work is brilliant. I think what he says about this idea of becoming vegan, it really matches up with what I'm trying to put across in the book, of this idea of the complications of vegan identity as not something that can be inhabited as stable and fixed, but is something that must always be negotiated. I think talking about vegan, vegetarian vampires is interesting, right? Because in most of the cases, these vampires certainly aren't vegetarian in that they are eating meat, but they certainly inhabit this space of often just a kind of denigration of vegetarianism as only ever a restriction, that we're constantly trying to kind of hide our innate appetites. And so in that sense, they play very much into a lot of what I'm saying about what's happening in Wells and what's happening in Atwood, and how they also negotiate with the anxieties that seem to be caused by vegetarianism in general. So I think it's part of a very similar tradition. And obviously, I'm not looking explicitly at media and film in the book, because the focus is really on the writing of veganism. And that, again, is why I think that fourth criteria is really important to the book, because it's about what literary vegans are doing and how they engage in a kind of slightly different way than these more filmic or television characters, because they are grappling with this kind of slightly different question of writing the self.
Yes, I see. And you raised something very interesting there, which is the fact that some of the authors with which you're engaging are not sympathetic to veganism and vegetarianism, whereas some of them are. And so do you think that the sympathetic authors present the monstrous vegan in a different way to the unsympathetic authors? Or do you think that the fact that the monstrous vegan is inherently in tension means that it's a trope that can be deployed perfectly well by someone who is sympathetic or not sympathetic to veganism and vegetarianism?
Yeah, I think the latter. I mean, I would say that none of the authors are particularly wholeheartedly sympathetic. I think they all have fairly ambivalent views, which is apt in a figure that I suggest is kind of at heart very ambivalent. So Wells is particularly interesting because he's very, on the surface, very denigratory of vegetarianism. And that's been commented on by several scholars, that vegetarians are lesbians or, ascetics, that they refuse to live in the world. But at the same time, in his later fiction in particular, vegetarianism is posited as what the world inevitably will lead to, right? So in a modern utopia, he paints a kind of socialist utopia in which everyone is vegetarian because only a barbarian would possibly slaughter animals. They can't find anyone to do it anymore. And so there is this sense in which it is acknowledged as a necessary social goal, but he's so, the body isn't there yet. The body still desires meat, and therefore it would only be repressive to deny those urges. So with him, there's already this tension in, I think, his thought about vegetarianism, about a utopian goal versus kind of what that means in the present. So I would say that that is a kind of prevalent idea throughout all of the authors I look at, and that's what makes the monster, I think, a particularly useful figure for them.
Let me ask a little bit about part 2, because this is when you start to talk about how we can perform or inhabit this figure of the monstrous vegan. And I hope you don't mind me saying, I found some of the ideas in part two a little bit trickier than the ideas in part one, because you were drawing from these texts that in many ways are much more complicated. And also you're drawing from these texts and trying to understand ways that we could live. So you look at ways we could embrace the monstrous vegan. And one of the texts you look at, or one of the sets of texts you look at, comes from Coetzee and his work on Elizabeth Costello. Now, Elizabeth Costello is a fictional writer who argues in defense of animals, but you present Costello herself as a kind of monstrous vegan. It's not obvious to me how she's similar to Frankenstein's monster, and she doesn't obviously seem monstrous in the same way that many of the characters in the first part of the book are. So in what sense do you think Costello herself is a monstrous vegan?
Yeah, so this is where I extend this concept beyond the kind of science fictional tradition and suggest that it can apply even in less obvious ways. So Costello, to me, meets the criteria, one, because she refuses meat, and that does cause often inexplicable anxiety, at least with Norma, right? Her daughter-in-law causes a lot of tension at the kind of academic dinner table. So in that sense, she meets that. She is very much this metatextual figure that there's a constant emphasis throughout the text on her status as a created being at the hands of Coetzee, a male author. So in that sense, she is a figure sired outside of heterosexual reproduction as a kind of figure of a male authorship and the anxieties that evokes, and someone intimately entangled with questions of the literary. In relation to, I guess, the second criteria, she's repeatedly throughout the text referred to as a seal, a dog, that there's this question of her kind of taxonomic status. So in that sense, she meets the criteria, but why she's useful to think about is because she is this, vegetarian figure who Coetzee uses to kind of question what it means to be a vegetarian. That a lot of what Elizabeth Costello says in the text, he's then said directly in kind of animal rights interviews. And so he comes to kind of directly mirror her speech, and lots of people have critiqued him for just using Costello to not have to embrace his vegetarianism completely and to distance himself from it. And I think that doesn't really acknowledge what he's actually doing here, which is thinking about what it means to have this ethical identity and that it is necessarily a performance of sorts. And so in that second part of the book, I consider actually, rather than therefore trying to say, oh, well, it's not a performance, it's in my body, it's an inherent feeling, that actually there might be something more positive to be gained from embracing veganism as a performance, as something you put on, because trying to instill it as an embodied reaction, it risks a certain essentialism that has been very damaging kind of in various other contexts. And so thinking about what performing it might lead to.
So what does reading Elizabeth Costello or Coetzee's other works tell us about how we can act as or perform as a vegan?
So I think that this idea of performing a monstrous veganism, right, performing oneself as a disruptive presence, in the book, I kind of suggest that this might be a way of protecting ourselves, right? That Costello is interested in, or is traumatized and haunted by, the suffering of animals. But that actual animal suffering is not addressed in the text itself. That remains in absence. And rather than kind of what Carol Adams has long suggested, is that we need to recover that. And we need to re-embody the animal. We need to witness the suffering. When I came on the podcast last, I was talking about work on vegan camp, which is related here in that, that can be really paralyzing and it can be really damaging, and it doesn't always necessarily lead to good solutions. And so how do we recognize that we are distanced from the animal, that there is a distance there, that we don't always necessarily want to continually uncover suffering? So Costello, this kind of performance of a disruptive self, performance of vegetarianism, while shielding her to a certain extent from having to just be confronting violence. So I'm hoping this isn't too rambling, but the idea is that, performing it gives us a temporary identity to occupy, which mirrors what I'm saying about veganism as a temporary stability that is helpful, but doesn't make the difficulty go away.
So is the idea that we can step into the role of the monstrous vegan when we are in public, say, and then step out of it when we're at home, so we don't have to panic about animal suffering?
Or not even step out of it, right? Embrace it as this kind of difficult position. But I think certainly performing it in public is is, I think, useful, and it ties into Richard Twine's really excellent work on the vegan killjoy and the power of being this disruptive presence in the social sphere. And so that monstrosity as something that is useful in that regard.
Good. So do you think this is a kind of reclaiming? It's about claiming an identity that is presented to vegans as a criticism, as a critique.
100% a reclaiming, right? That the vegan is so often demonized in contemporary culture as monstrous, right? Whether it's mothers who are killing their children through enforcing vegan diets, whether it's the vegetarian vampires that we've spoken about. And rather than saying, no, we're not monsters, it's actually, well, yes, we are, because we're not pure. We're not morally superior beings, but we are beings trying to grapple with these difficulties and not shying away from them. And certainly Frankenstein provides a really great model there, because in contemporary culture, Frankenstein's monster appears as this kind of murderous, horrible, disgusting thing. But when you turn back to the book, he's a wonderfully peaceful, benevolent figure who, really has utopian aspirations for what the world could be. And so, that's a pretty, I think, great model for veganism, that it's not perfect, that it's not going to give you this kind of wonderful, perfect identity, but it is a desire for different things.
That's really interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned this trope of the mothers killing the babies, right? Feeding them a vegan diet. Because, of course, one of the ways that Frankenstein's monster is not an angel is the fact that Frankenstein's monster does kill children and does kill wives and does kill the family members of Victor Frankenstein. And I think that there's an interesting question about the relationship to, you talk about this a little bit in the book, but the relationship between veganism and antinatalism, right? There is this strong overlap in some vegan circles with skepticism about having children, with skepticism about the world that we're bringing children into. And that can easily be framed as a kind of monstrous vision. I'm very interested in how this monstrous vegan relates to children and the idea of the future of humanity, and even perhaps whether the monstrous vegan idea does posit a future of humanity, or whether it posits a future of something different from humanity.
Yeah, there's lots to unpack there. I would say that certainly this antinatalist idea it's not, I would definitely not position myself as saying the monstrous vegan is promoting a kind of stop having children. And certainly Atwood's vision of the vegan suggests that in the Mad Adam trilogy, it's everyone must die and then the kind of post-human vegan can emerge. And she, I think, is very much satirizing this idea that, the need for drastic human population reduction. But I think the monstrous vegan does challenge a certain logic of reproductive futurity in that, as you say, Frankenstein's monster is associated with child killing, but the killing of a child too is very much part of very normative networks. And so I conceive, at least in a theoretical idea of veganism as reproducing the future differently, and that therefore that doesn't recreate the social order in its current state. And so that can seem like a kind of failure of reproduction. The other thing I note in the book, which is something that I'm interested in, but haven't necessarily thought about enough to really say anything definitive, but this idea that vegan rhetoric, certainly in the present, is often invested in the child and the future of everything. But in aiming for a worldwide veganism, what we're really doing is aiming to stop the reproduction of animals, right? That there would be less animals in a vegan future, that we would stop their kind of endless, excessive reproduction in artificial insemination or through farming practices. And so there is an interesting tension there in terms of the desire to limit that level of reproduction.
Let me ask a similar question. Do you think the monstrous vegan is a necessarily misanthropic character?
Yes, and certainly misanthropy is a subject that I really am trying to think a lot more about in my kind of current and future work. I think he's definitely I say he, sorry, it's not always necessarily a he, but in most of my examples he is, but definitely a misanthropic figure, right? That it's grappling with, and that's a misanthropy directed not only outward at meat eaters, but a misanthropy directed at the self, right? And the difficulty of inhabiting this human world and what we're meant to do. And that, again, I think is why the monstrous vegan identity is important, because it's not valorizing the vegan as the perfect human, but embracing kind of, okay, well, it's really difficult to love humanity.
Is there not a danger, though, that we might be playing into our critics' hands there when we say, oh yes, this type of veganism, this way of performing veganism is misanthropic. Because of course, one of the common challenges labelled or presented at vegans is that they are misanthropic, that they care more about animals or the environment than they do about people, and that is a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a risk, but I would say that at the heart of the conceptualization of the Monstrous Vegan is a utopian striving, right? And so it's not embracing this kind of relentless pessimism. It is retaining a sense that there is a future that could be better, and thinking about how we can enact that utopianism in the present. And also in the book, I really don't talk about animals at all. And that's something I address in the introduction as, perhaps a huge problem. But also, actually, the book is about what it means to be human. It's not really about our interactions with other animals. It's about how we interact with each other and how we interact with ourselves. So in that sense, I would say it's a reinvestment in the human and what it could be, as opposed to a misanthropic turning away altogether from the human.
Now, there are so many things we could talk about further in the book, but that strikes me as a really useful point, a really hopeful point on which to pause and to turn to our regular questions, except they're not our regular questions because you are a returning guest. So rather than the 5 quick questions, you get 4 quick questions. So are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
I am, Josh.
What's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting animal studies research?
So I think there's been, lots, but I think probably for me, it's the moment when a student comes to you after a lecture or after you've taught something animals focused, and they tell you they've been really inspired. Now they want to write about animals in their own work, or, they've become vegetarian. I don't necessarily think the role of university teaching is to, convert, but it's always a nice bonus when you do. But yeah, I think anytime a student says that they, now want to write their essay about animal studies stuff, or they want to explore animal studies further, I find that really rewarding, that it is kind of doing something.
What's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research?
I think it's always going to be the deep existential fear that what we write is doing nothing, right? What does a book about other books in a really, a pretty theoretically dense way do anything for animals? But I think that's why I am so interested in part 2 of the book and in my prior work on Vegan Camp, on what we can actually do with this sense of like failure and insufficiency, and how might these negative affects actually be an asset to vegan futures. So in that sense, I guess my work is moving towards grappling with that disheartening aspect.
Now, this next question is a chance for you to give a shout out to someone who you think we should be paying attention to, but maybe we aren't. So can you think of an animal studies scholar that you'd like to make listeners aware of? So it could be an emerging scholar, it could be someone who's written in the field but hasn't received the attention you think they deserve, someone who publishes in a language other than English, or someone who is in an adjacent discipline who maybe animal studies people haven't noticed. Just someone who you think maybe our listeners won't be aware of, but they really should be.
Well, I thought I'd use this moment to promote kind of upcoming work in vegan studies, given that is kind of my subsection of animal studies. So I think Eva Giroud in particular, who I'm sure many people will be super familiar with, but she's always doing great work, and her new book on veganism, which came out with Bloomsbury in 2021, is really excellent and offers such a good overview of the field. And also Carrie Hamilton's work on veganism, I think, is really excellent. They've got a great article on leather and mourning that's well worth looking up, and also a book on veganism that came out in 2019.
And here's the big question. And this ties very neatly to the questions of utopianism and imperfection that you're addressing in the book. Are you optimistic about the future of human and non-human animal relations?
I am optimistic that I will be optimistic, if that works.
I suppose it does. So the thought is that you can control your own attitudes towards this, and you are hopeful that you will come to think better?
Yeah, I'm hopeful that something will come along that will make me feel hopeful.
Ah, I see. Yes, good. So we don't have reason to be hopeful right now, but we have reason to hope that we will have reason to be hopeful.
Exactly. Yeah.
I like that. That's a nice image. That's a different kind of optimism. I like that. Kind of one step removed optimism.
Yeah. Not pessimism per se, but it's close.
What are you working on next?
I've been working with Laura Wright on the Edinburgh Companion to Vegan Literary Studies, which of course you yourself are featured in. So that's coming out, I hope, in September of this year. And I'm doing a few kind of chapters for various books, but my main overall project is to start thinking more about misanthropy.
And how can people find out more about your work?
They can look me up on the University of Amsterdam website. My profile page there has my most up-to-date stuff. And then I am also on Twitter. I don't post anything very interesting, just links to my work. So that's a good place if they just want the pure facts. I'm like at Emelia Quinn.
Well, thanks, Emelia, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks, Josh.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and you can just find us at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.